Welcome everyone. This is one more Mind Culture podcast, and today I have Imani, Rameses, and Sebastian Behinger, who are young makers from Vienna and very interested in a very interesting field of neuroaesthetics and choreography and performance and overlap with neuroaesthetics, which I find quite fascinating. So I hope today we can get to know a little bit more about this and a little bit more about them. So I'm wondering, could you first tell me where you come from and a little bit introduce yourself in, I don't know, few sentences. I'm curious to hear your story because I don't know everything yet. So I'm wondering.
Okay, yeah, I can start. About me, where do I come from? Well, I'm from the States. I'm from the Midwest area, Indianapolis, Indiana. Maybe you know where that is, maybe you don't.
Midwest. I
Midwest
understand.
area. Yeah, that's all you need to know. Yeah, born and raised. Yeah, and I've been really deep in the sciences for as long as I can remember. Thanks, Dad. And yeah, that coupled with being a dancer and being trained has also been really a part of my history as well. And my route is kind of all over the place, how I finally stumbled upon this area of neuroaesthetics and empirical aesthetics in general. Started off with more of a focus in the body in general. As far as from the science perspective, I wanted to be a doctor, I wanted to be a thoracic surgeon, I was really into the body. And at the same time, I was dancing, I was classically trained in Balanchine ballet, and then also was doing African styles and modern and jazz and all these things. I'm just trying to balance both of them. But then I realized I really didn't want to go to medical school, which was a very difficult decision to make, I would say. But then I started realizing, well, okay, if not medical school, I don't want to let go of my love for the biological form of the human body. How do I find this marriage, between my interest in art and my interest in science? And I spent one summer on the porch or the veranda, or whatever you want to call it, of my co-op that I was living in. And I was doing nothing but reading papers. And I just remember having my breakfast, my eggs, my toast, my cereal, and a stack of papers. And that's what I did every morning during the summer, was just read these papers. And I started finding these names, and I thought, okay, there's a pattern here. Who are these people? Who are these researchers? I finally contacted them via email and was just kind of stalking them a bit. It's hey, I'm really interested and fascinating what you're doing, and I would love to know more. I would love to know if it's possible for me to work in a lab or things like this. And they suggested that I apply to a master's program here in Vienna, which was in English. And it was a cognitive science program. And I thought, okay, well, I'll do that. Applied, got in. I'm here, been here for 4 years now. And this is where I was able to really dive into the area of neuroaesthetics. And I specifically chose Vienna because everyone's like, why Vienna? Why Vienna? You're from America. That's where the most, astute institutions, academic institutions are. And I thought, well, to be honest, nothing like empirical aesthetics or neuroaesthetics existed as a hub in America. There was no hub, there was no lab, there was no group of researchers really focused in this area in America. There is now at Penn, at UPenn, but this one here in Vienna is the oldest and I would say the most established lab here at the University of Vienna. And so, yeah, came here, started working in the lab, and was first working with visual aesthetics, because this is what I was interested in, was mainly in how do we understand, or how do we begin to understand how people are perceiving negative art, specifically the grotesque and the disgusting. This is one of my fascinations. And I enjoyed it, and I learned a lot, and acquired a lot of different tools. But I wasn't passionate about it, and I was really tired of being in front of a computer screen. And I thought, well, duh, Imani, you're a dancer. You've been dancing forever. Why don't you figure out a way to marry the two? And then, my thesis work came about, and I started doing work with dancers and integrating the neuroaesthetic and psychological and just cognitive science in general, these different methodologies into my practice. And now I'm continuing on that path, going a little deeper in the philosophical area, because there's so many philosophical layers in this field. But now we're just continuing to develop the practice, because it's still a rather young field. And there's a few other researchers that are doing really monumental things around the globe, but it's nice to be here where something's really been established. So just continuing now at the moment.
And then you met Sebastian.
And then I met Sebastian. Yeah, we met at
Tanzquartier Docks.
We met at Tanzquartier Docks, and he was sharing one of his writings, and he started asking me some questions about neuroaesthetics, and I don't remember exactly what the question was.
Actually, I met you a year before I shared my writing, and then I remember we spoke afterwards a bit about neuroaesthetics, and then I asked you what you did, and you said you're studying neuroaesthetics because you're still doing your MA.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, does that have to do with mirror neurons? And you were like, oh yeah, mirror neurons.
Old stuff.
Like
I wasn't. I'm not specifically studying mirror neurons, but
And then you disappeared, and I was like, she was cool. She knows some cool stuff.
I can be really enigmatic sometimes about things that I do.
Sebastian, you come from England, right? And you're a BMC practitioner?
Yeah, so I'm half English, half German, which is quite a big thing in terms of me ending up in Austria, because my mum's German, so I grew up not speaking German at home, but I know enough German to feel like I can move here. But I grew up in England, and I come from a family of doctors. So in my family there's a lot of neurologists. My dad's actually an epidemiologist, so he sort of branched off into a lot into vaccinology and immunology. And then my mum's an occupational therapist. My grandmother's a psychotherapist. So, and there's a lot of also neurologists in like my mum's side, and was also, I found my family's also a very musical family. So I was always like being pushed to learn instruments. But then I rebelled and left my orchestra that I was supposed to be playing with, and the next door there was a drama class. And I went into the drama class, and then I would turn up every week with my flute. I was playing the flute. I came every week with my flute and my music. And then everyone was like, why does Sebastian always bring a flute and a sheet music to the drama lessons? Because my parents would drive like me and my brother and my sister to this place where both rehearsals happen at the same time. And then in the summer show I was like, actually not in the piece they expected. So that's sort of how I started my sort of artist path. Yeah, so my parents were surprised to find me in the wrong performance in the summer show. And then I worked with the theatre director who was doing youth theatre, and then she invited me to the adult company and she's working a lot with like people with autism and Down syndrome, so I was also assisting her with that work. And then I applied for theatre at Dartington College of Arts, which was very well known for being like the first place that did devised theatre as part of an academic programme, and it was very known for having like this very, very radical experimental approach to performance. And they used to be very, very integrative of like movement and theatre together. And then when I got there, the theatre course became more conceptual and then split choreography into a separate course. And I was like, I've got to, like, I want to work with my body. I want to work with my body. So people were like, why don't you do choreography? And I was like, well, I don't have any dance background at all. And they're like, doesn't matter. Like, there's loads of people who graduated from choreography here who don't have a dance background. So I spoke to the tutors and I sort of did an internal audition and they took me. And I dived headfirst into choreography BA, which was completely overwhelming, like not having the dance background beforehand. And while I was there, we had a lot of somatic-based instruction. So we had one teacher who did a lot of Gindler work, which was like a very old somatic practice. It was like, Gindler was really one of the first practitioners. She was a contemporary with Alexander, who developed the Alexander technique, but she wasn't so well known because she had most of her writings burnt by the Nazis. And
that's sad.
yeah, and a lot of her students fled to America and then they established their own techniques, and then the American culture sort of asked them to brand it and give it a, trademark it. And but I really think of her as like the great grandmother of a lot of somatic practices. And she had no certification program. She was just like, we're just some people doing some research. But then my teacher was doing Gindler, was also doing the body mind centering certification in order that she could have something to say like, I'm a somatic professional. So she combined the two, and then I did a workshop with Bonnie Bainbridge-Cohen, who's the founder of BMC, and just completely fell in love with how she was working. And she was doing embryology, and I loved embryology, so I was like, okay, I've got to do this. So
embryology is like studying the children development, or what is it exactly?
Yeah, well, actually, yeah.
I have no idea, I'm just figuring out.
Yeah, so actually in body mind centering, there's a big study of from conception to around the time when you're walking. And so we look at all of the major developmental movement patterns between conception and walking, and then embryology specifically focuses on the first roughly 12 weeks after conception. So it's the time when your basic body plan is forming, when you go from, if you think about it, you start as a cell or as a fertilized egg, and then you have like limbs and fingers and like a spleen in the right place and like 2 lungs with 5 different lobes, and you develop this huge degree of differentiation. And in body mind centering, we look at embryology as an embodiment of space rather than an embodiment of structure. So you sort of start with like a yolk sac in the front, which is a lot about nourishment, and then you have an amniotic sac, which is tiny, which is behind you, and you like internalize this yolk sac and it becomes your gut tube, and then you spread this amniotic sac round and it becomes the sort of the sea you swim in while you're developing.
So basically, like, this is a kind of metaphor that you use for improving yourself at this adult stage?
Sort of. Like, so a lot of the structures that we have, particularly if you look at the connective tissue, like a lot of the spirals in our limbs, for example, come from this embryological spiraling. And like a lot of the way that the organs are positioned also comes from like there's a sort of a resonance in the connective tissue particularly. And also there's just, I think with BMC there's a very phenomenological approach, so there's a lot of like, if I imagine the yolk sac, then there's like a particular quality of experience which happens, which we start to embody, and which you can, if you do it in a group, that you can start to sort of feel as a common quality. And I think there's a level of like, it's a bit magic, like no one really knows the mechanisms of why there's such strong experiences that people have when they embody embryology. But there's a very, very vivid set of experiences that people go into. That's also kind of, there's a commonality too.
Wow, I find it very fascinating. Like I did like Feldenkrais a lot for myself, so that's, I guess, other spectrum somatic methods. So I took BMC workshops, and it's always like there's always been this now feel your liver or now feel your. So I mean, to get to this level, like I always find it magical how is the difference like between actually what you actually feel and what you think you feel or you imagine you feel. And I wonder if you can get to actually feeling it, like, or you feel like, have you found yourself being at the level where you can say that you're actually feeling like some of your internal organs, or how deep are you in the practice? I'm curious.
Right, yeah. I mean, so in terms of like the internal body, in the certification program, you really spend like a whole week on each body system. So we do like a week on the organs and a week on the endocrine glands and a week on the nervous system and a week on the muscles, etc. And by the end of by the end of that level of immersion, you're really like, you know when you're in a gland or you're in a tissue, or like, so yeah, in body mind centering you develop this very, very highly, like I'd say almost microscopic level of awareness of your body tissues. But you mentioned Feldenkrais, like we always sort of are integrating like the body systems work with the developmental work. And Feldenkrais also worked with infant development, but he worked with it in like through quite a different approach. He was working with it like a lot through like the sort of dynamical systems theory approach, which is a lot about like how change happens when we receive a certain kind of challenge from the outside that forces us to like reorganize ourselves. Whereas in body mind centering, we work a lot through a neuromaturational approach, which is like the idea being that there's certain stages of brain development that happen in a particular, like along a particular time clock, and then that you're sort of working with a sequence of those stages that happen. So for example, when a baby's born, it's only really got coordination of its mouth and like whatever it needs to support the coordination of the mouth in order to feed, and then like quite soon it discovers its hands and it can use its hands symmetrically, and then it'll be moving the arms but it won't be coordinating the movement, and then gradually there'll be like, you know, the legs will come in and there'll be like a lateral differentiation and then it'll sort of become diagonal. And I think the two approaches are actually very complementary of each other, and I have a lot of respect for Feldenkrais and how Feldenkrais was approaching very similar material but through a very different lens.
Well, I think it's like the idea of like awareness of being infinitely, like you can infinitely split in half. So that's one of the ideas. So you can sense a difference between like movement A or movement B in a certain range. You can also, if you can sense a certain range, you can sense half of this range and half of this range. Like you just have to concentrate long enough. And like experientially, I feel it. Like I know about that this is true. But it takes extremely long time. So I'm wondering, like, if you can achieve this within a week. Like, it sounds almost impossible to me, because it's like I know, like I could go really deep for like doing it for 4 years every day, but I never really, like, there's been some levels that I didn't cross, like, because it's but Feldenkrais always worked with movement, so it's maybe the difference here is like. That you refer to change of a body part in space, let's put it like this, or in relationship to itself, but it's never been like actually observing kind of static structure. I'm wondering.
Yeah, and this, like, if you read Feldenkrais' writing, he talks a lot about like that his work is really happening mainly in like the parietal cortex, but he talks about like cortical learning. Mm-hmm. And then with body mind centering, Bonnie's always talking about like the basal ganglia and the brain stem and looking at subcortical structures. So I think it's kind of interesting to compare that they're both working with the brain, but like one's really like below the cortex and one's really at the cortex. And I think that's part of where I think they're very complementary to each other. And this kind of learning that you're talking about of this like this noticing small differences, I think we do also do that in BMC, but we do it in a very different way, because we're more about like the body systems differentiation of like if I'm moving if I'm like flexing or extending my fingers, like if I experience that differently by changing whether I'm focusing on my muscles or if I'm focusing on my bones, or if I'm focusing on my ligaments, or however I'm
I find it super
shifting
fascinating.
focus.
We're going to the neuroaesthetics soon, but I wonder, like, because this again, like, for me, it's a very similar approach to, for example, Buto or Grotowski theater, or, you know, this kind of practices that are less shape oriented, so less like ballet, but more like kind of performing a state, and then like having those kind of images is extremely powerful. Like in Buto is maybe deaf, or in Grotowski some kind of strong, I don't know. I don't really know. I never did Grotowski. But I'm just reading a lot about it. But it's like there's. I think if you train yourself in experiencing those images, I think you can do a lot of artistically interesting things.
Yeah. And like maybe a little bridge to the neuroaesthetic, or to this, from the somatic at least with the aesthetic. Like one of my big passions is the viewpoints, which is the work of Mary Overley. And what people generally know about the viewpoints is she talks about working with space, shape, time, emotion, movement, and story. But what's I think less known is that she talks about working through them with the 9 laboratories. And the first laboratory is called the News of a Difference laboratory. And the essential idea is whichever viewpoint you're in, like that you notice the difference between if my hand is here or if my hand is here. And how do I aesthetically experience that difference? And I think what she's really doing is Feldenkraisian learning. But she's applying it like, okay, rather than inside, within the internal body, she's putting it into space and putting it into theatre and putting it onto stage. And I found like the viewpoints has been a really big bridge for me of like, how do I bridge this kind of awareness, which I've been developing as a somatic practitioner? And then how do I like actually practically bridge that onto like into a performative context? But not in a way of like, I think a lot of my BMC colleagues are like making a piece about dancing their organs. And I respect that. And I think that's a valid application, but it's not the application I'm interested in. I'm interested in the kind of consciousness you develop whilst doing it, and using that rather than using the material of the study.
I would say like there's a strong movement of this kind of in contemporary choreography, especially the avant-garde. It's just like, or I could say that Philipp Geimacher or Georg Blaschke, or generally the HZT University in Berlin, like it's very focused on this, like from the somatic into performing. And like myself, like I can talk about my experience where like whenever I would do Feldenkrais and then go on stage later, it would just be massive difference of like the amount of presence that I would have. So how much of it is an aesthetical experience and how much of it is like being able to connect to a performer on stage because he's aware of everything within the body, I think maybe first, when we get into this topic, I would like to know a little bit more what is the field of neuroaesthetics, because I have read a little bit on the internet, and I've always been interested in brain stuff, and it seems to me like a bunch of people trying to understand why we like the art versus the other art. And I'm just wondering if you could explain this to me better, like what is exactly the field of study and how you relate to this.
I mean, you summarized it in a very simple way, which is efficient, in my opinion. But it's really the field of neuroaesthetics, which is different from the field of empirical aesthetics. The field of neuroaesthetics is attempting to create some form of understanding of how and why you perceive art the way you do from a neurological perspective. So the how and the why is the most important for them. The how is essentially where we're beginning. The why is still something that is being argued and debated. But mainly there is an attempt to try to empirically or objectively capture the aesthetic experience that you're having by giving you some form of a stimuli to be in relation to. And from that stimuli, there's some hypothesis, or there's some idea, or there's some conception, there's some assumption sometimes that you are going to have some form of a perceptual experience when in relation to a painting, music, poetry, a dance piece. And what they're doing is trying to tie that, or what we're doing is trying to tie that back to some form of a psychology, a philosophy, and specifically more of a neurobiological implication. I would say you guys were talking about cortical and subcortical things, which is interesting within this topic, because a lot of the work that we're doing is on a cortical level, just because that is the limitation of the technology at the moment. But what I think essentially we're trying to get to, or what we keep pointing to, is all sort of subcortical regions and all subcortical functionality. We're really trying to dive into these areas, but there's really no way for us to measure such phenomena. There's really no way for us to capture some form of a objective assessment or evaluation of such phenomena. We're not there yet. But subcortically, we can make some, I would say, assumptions of what's going on when you're having an aesthetic experience. Yeah.
So there are tons of questions, but my first one would be like, what is an aesthetical experience?
That is very challenging for me to answer. That is a widely debated question.
Uh-huh.
Yes, that's a very widely debated question. What is an aesthetic experience? I really don't want to answer that question because I think that there's too much of a variation for me to come to some like full, comprehensive form of encapsulating what is an aesthetic experience. I feel like that is something that's been asked for centuries and is continuing to be the question at large. Yeah.
I'm wondering, because if you say you're studying the aesthetic experience, then first you have to define the aesthetic experience. Or is every researcher defining their own aesthetic experience interpretation? Or is it...
In a way, there is an... How do I put this? There are a list of criteria or components that would enable one to undergo an aesthetic experience, but the aesthetic experience itself is going to vary and have different contexts that are related to an emotion specifically, or related to in general, whether it's something that's pleasurable or it's something that's displeasurable. Does that make sense?
But is aesthetic, I mean, yes, but I'm just wondering like if it's always pleasure, because sometimes
No, in my lab, we actually, like,
As
I
you
was doing work
Yeah.
with disgust and the grotesque. That's an aesthetic experience. One of my colleagues, who is from Japan, he was working with sublime experiences, which is really difficult to define as being something that's pleasurable or rather something that's terrifying, you know?
So you would, for example, study the work of Joseph Beuys.
For example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I get it. It's like, can be disgusting.
Yeah,
It
and it's really
beautiful.
It's really based on the stimuli itself. You know, we have to kind of not necessarily work backwards, but there is some form of a deductive reasoning that's happening alongside all of this inductive reasoning that we're creating around this topic.
One thing that I find very interesting, sort of, I'm quite new to the field of neuroaesthetics. If we got into it through Imani, like I've sort of had interest in the brain and interest in art, like in parallel. And I'm only just starting to like read literature about neuroaesthetics. And I've started with Ramachandran and a little bit of Ian McGilchrist, who are both psychiatrists who work with looking at neurology what's sort of quite interesting is that they're both, I think I like a lot of what they're writing, but when they're looking at like what is the art, what is the aesthetic experiences, they're really looking at like painting mainly.
Yeah.
And they're taking quite a traditional definition of like, in a sense they're taking like the safest possible definition of like art by really sort of looking at the kind of art that you expect to see in a very conservative art history book, I would say. And it's not that I don't have an appreciation of like painting as an art, but it's like, I think what's kind of interesting for us in this field is we're like, well, wait a second, like what if we're not looking at, what if we take similar principles but apply them into the field of performance? Or what if we take them into, like, I think in a lot of the avant-garde world of art, we're sort of often looking at like, what is this edge of, is it art or not? And like, we're looking at like these places where it's actually not so easy to define the artness of it.
Yeah.
And I think that but then becomes really interesting with like applying neuroaesthetics.
And neuroaesthetics is doing this. There's a lot of publications from within my lab, from Himoleta and from Anjan Chatterjee and from Matthew Pulaski, who was my supervisor. There's a lot of work where they're asking the question, well, is it art? Is this art or not? And what's allowing you to undergo some form of a aesthetic experience while viewing this art? But Sebastian is right. There is a limitation, which is what I found when I was actually working in my lab, that there's, and so much so because it's a visual aesthetics lab. They're focusing on paintings and they're focusing on sculptures and they're doing things within museums. But I was kind of the odd one out because I'm like, no, I want to do things with movement. I want to do things with performance. But this also is a limitation within the technology as well, because science is always moving forward in relation to whatever technological advances we have. That's just kind of how it is trying to work in order to call it self-objective, And so I think that within that limitation of technology, the field of neuroaesthetics was really focused on paintings because it was also a really controlled and fixed environment from which they could be able to actually track some form of your eye tracking, how long are you looking at a naked painting and what area of the body are you looking at when you're looking at this painting, or when you're looking at a painting from the Far East versus something that's from a more Western painter, things like this. They were putting a fixed environment so from which they could be able to pull apart and kind of take this reductionist perspective on what's actually happening during that experience.
Yeah, when I was researching about, I also found like a lot. I was wondering why it's just about paintings.
Yeah,
that was
the technology.
But it makes sense if you want to create like a safe and like a
reproducible environment. Yeah,
that's the word I was looking for.
It's standard. That's very standard scientific practice, and we're moving away from that. Like in my thesis, I was able to work with a NIRS device, a near-infrared spectrometer, and we were able to measure cortical regions of activation while the dancers were dancing. And this was beautiful, and this is groundbreaking work because no one is really pushing this edge yet because the technology just arrived a few years ago, So we're just now being able to be like, oh, okay, now we can actually put people in a performative context, have them move, because a previous, fMRI device has you in a tube and you can't move, and this was a different approach. And so the technology is progressing and now we're progressing. So it's really promising.
So I'm wondering, because I from what I learned so far, there's this big question, like, which approach is the correct approach? Like, in neuroaesthetics, is like, is the aesthetical experience the function of the older parts of the brain or the newer parts of the brain? Let's say, or the brain or the nervous system, let's say, for this reason. So is it more a primal thing, or is it more like a learned, new, evolved human thing?
Oh, man.
I wonder what is your take on this?
Here we go.
You're asking such a large question.
No, I mean, obviously it's a question probably that no one can answer, but I'm just wondering what you think. Like, what would be your take on it? You cannot totally dodge it. Like you
Yeah, I'm
cannot-
gonna dodge it. I'm definitely gonna curve.
I'm gonna say, like, I would imagine it would depend what kind of art you're experiencing, and like on a very subjective, like on a, you know, not on a sort of reductionistic level, like I sort of feel some pieces of art really like go into my amygdala and are really like, you know, give me these very visceral emotional reactions where I want to run away or I want to get closer or whatever. And some pieces put me into a more contemplative space.
Yeah,
And like, and I
yeah.
feel
And
like
this
just
is-
on a very subjective level, I feel
Yeah,
like they're
it's
both
super
are aesthetic
subjective.
experiences. They're both experiences of art, but I can like, they go in different places.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, it's really, there's also a lot of studies in which it's based on just your exposure to art. And are you an expert or are you a novice in this field? Or if you're an artist yourself, kind of thing. There's a lot of different preconceptions that influence whatever that experience is. Like Matthew Pulowski and Himmelt have a really beautiful model of what an aesthetic experience is. And before you even get to the painting, there's like all these different parameters that influence why you would perceive the painting the way you would, which is based on things that you would never be able to like really quantify. You know, it could be from this more embryonic stage, or it could be from, you know, the way you were raised. It could be from personality,
How much wine you had.
proclivities. Yeah, yeah. All these things are influenced. Culture is a huge one. There's all these things that happen pre-experience that we really can't even always account for when we're trying to understand such a phenomenon. And then there's also just the fact that like the field of neurophenomenology, which is something that I most recently am finding myself like falling in love with completely. This area is starting to really try to point to these really ephemeral things of like, okay, well, why are you having such an experience? And what is making that experience be experienced in such a way? And what's making it have this like first or second order of like being a phenomena versus being aware that you're aware of the phenomena, you know, these type of things that they're moving into, which is really acting in complement to the experience itself. And then you start to perhaps move into the subcortical areas. But it's, like I said, it's hard. It's very challenging to know.
I think something that your question reminds me of is a cartoon I drew recently, where a neuroaestheticist is like having a conversation with a post-structuralist.
Nice.
And like,
Nice.
and I think like in a lot of the avant-garde arts, we're very influenced by a lot of post-structuralist thinking and this idea of like, you know, nothing exists outside the text, and how I think that a lot of the post-structuralist ideas tend to move towards like everything is culture. Everything is like learnt from like a cultural environment. And I think what I found really sort of like really liberating when I first was starting to read about neuroaesthetics was I listened to a lecture by Ramachandran. It's called The Emerging Mind. It's a BBC Reith lecture podcast. We can share the link. But he says, he's like, what if even if 5% or 10% or like 2% of how we experience art is biological, like, and he's like, okay, there's all this variation that we see in what art is and how art manifests like throughout human history, throughout like geography. He says all of that variation is cultural, but what if there's this at least a small percentage that is like biological, that's hardwired. And I think there's something about that which I find very like, you know, having had a very sort of postmodernist art education was really like, hey, cool, that is a cool idea, because it's like maybe some things do exist outside the text. You know, maybe it's not that, like, maybe it's not everything is encapsulated within this kind of this cultural production. And And I think probably like most people would agree that like the percentage that is biology is probably relatively small compared to the cultural aspect of it. But I think the influence of that is potentially very, very powerful. And
from a perspective of choreography, like myself, I've always been interested in like how you can strip away the cultural part of it, because I feel like there's always been my big question, like how can I just communicate on the sensory level as opposed to giving signs or signifying something or creating context or and so on. So like that's of course like when I learned from my experiences with various curators and critics, it's unfortunately impossible or close to impossible to establish yourself as an artist if you post such things. But I always been really interested in like how can you create a dance that will not that will be aware of itself to a point that does not culturally signify, or at least the cultural signify element is reduced to the absolute minimum. Like the body is okay, a human. Yeah, we got
I
it.
think you would have to train your audience as well. It wouldn't be something that you could just present on stage and expect people to receive in such a way.
Yes.
You would really have to make the audience an integrated part of that experience over a period of time.
So I'm wondering if there's like, for example, a work group of BMC or a work group of Feldenkrais or a work group of maybe even contact improvisation. Maybe there is a kind of audience that maybe is able to perceive the dance beyond, is it meaning of certain way?
what you're talking about reminds me a little bit of Eugenia Barber's theatre anthropology project, where he was really looking at like inviting performers from all over the world to like look at like what's the technique that we share in common, even if like we appear to be doing really different work. And like he was doing these projects where he was traveling the world and like doing these, he called them bartering performances, where they would sort of exchange performance material with like indigenous tribes and things. And I find that a really interesting inquiry of like, if I go to a place that's not had any exposure to like Western, contemporary performance, what can I do that's recognizable? And like they were talking about how they started these bartering performances when they were like stuck in a village somewhere whilst they were traveling, and then they were like playing their instruments, rehearsing in a field, and they go and visit somebody in the town, and then everyone's like, oh, they've come to do their dances and play their songs. Oh yeah, they're doing a lot of sort of acrobatic warm-up, training exercises, and the villagers thought that those were their dances, and they sort of recognized it as dances, even though they were just like, no, this is like our they were sort of from this Grotowskian lineage, right? They're sort of, no, this is our like Grotowski stuff. It's like, no, you're dancing. And I find,
That's really interesting. But then that's also, again, relating back to the culture of the people that are perceiving it in a way. Like, it's still like, they call them dances because they consider those as dances, because maybe a movement out of ordinary is a dance. I'm just wondering.
Can I ask you a question?
Tell me. Go ahead.
Excuse me.
What do you find interesting about decontextualizing culture from a performance, and why? I'm just curious, because it's a really interesting topic, and it's something that also resonates with me as well, and I'd just be curious.
So I've always been interested in movement, like learning movement and especially learning, but also like I've not been given like the most athletic body or the most capable of learning body, so it's been extremely exciting for me always to learn new things. So it's been a journey for me since I remember. But then there is a part of me that is just so geeky about it, that is to the point of It's ridiculous. Like it shouldn't be so geeky about. Like what I realize when I go around and look at choreography, because I love to see choreography. I just see like people that do choreography are often not so geeky. They're not geeky about movement in general. They're geeky maybe about their subject or their identity or I don't know, mission, changing the world, whatever. But they're not often, in terms of choreography, not geeky about the core material itself. And I find the study of the core material itself as an extremely powerful thing. Like, and it's just like I found this quote today. I cannot say it because I have no memory, but it's something about artists from the neuroaesthetics, artists being a neuroscientist, just using different tools. So someone who tries to understand how human perception or human mind works. And in this, like, I feel like the movement, it is experience for someone who's doing, but it's also a certain experience for someone who's watching. And I've been experiencing myself this wonderful thing of movement being completely abstracted by languages, by movement languages. And those movement languages, they're just so annoying, because instead of watching someone, doing their beautiful thing, you're watching someone reproducing a certain movement pattern that they learned, that they're completely unaware of, and they just consider this as dance because they learned that this is dance. I think that dance is something that goes, or could be, or should be, in my little worldview, something that goes beyond like those learned patterns, and maybe you find like new languages, and the moment you find them and you establish them, you should already break them, because you're already doing what you don't want to do, which is you don't want to like I mean, at least I don't want to work in codes. I would rather work in like what's like beyond codes. But then it's this very, I would say, idealistic, geeky approach, because in the end it's just misunderstood. Like I had all these experiences where I just was like, okay, I'm deconstructing or heavily, take like removing some kind of ways of working with the body from the urban styles. So there's like a way of using the body, and I'm like taking them, building new like aesthetics, let's put it like this. And then in the end I show it on stage, and just in the end it's like, and like a famous curator comes to me and he says like, oh, you're doing urban dance. And it's like, it's hard. It's hard to take this approach, because I think it's extremely geeky. But at the same time, the less knowledge you have as a spectator, the more you're able to grasp the actual essence of it. Like, I feel it really communicates that.
Yeah, and I think it's very time intensive, because if you're composing dance, like if you have a predefined vocabulary, then it's like, okay, you just sequence the movements in that vocabulary together.
Laziness.
And then, well, or you could call it laziness or efficiency, but like to really produce like dance that's really readable without needing that vocabulary, I think is just extremely time intensive. And like what you're saying reminds me of...
Do you want it to be readable?
Do you want it to be? Well, that's another question. But like, it reminds me a bit of Jonathan Burrows, the choreographer who wrote a book called The Choreographer's Handbook. And he outlines what he calls the electric guitar problem. And he said, like, here's the thing. Usually you hear rock music and then you buy an electric guitar. With dance, you go to a ballet class and then you watch a ballet. And I've been thinking about this electric guitar problem for a long time. And then like recently I started reading about, finally read about mirror neurons and about like, so they've been in the air in choreography for a while. Everyone sort of talks about mirror neurons. But then like finally I read about Rizzolatti's original study.
Yes.
Where
Thank you.
He was looking at...
Thank you for reading the original study.
Well, I read Ramachandran's summary of the original study, but like...
You should read the original study.
But I'll summarize the summary. So like in my summary of the summary of the summary, like he's so this researcher was a Lati. He was looking at monkeys. I can't remember which species of monkey, but he's looking at monkeys, and he was measuring like the activity in the parietal cortex. So for audience out there, the parietal cortex is about organizing your perception of space and of movement. So he was like observing like, okay, if they pick up a peanut, then like these neurons fire. But then he noticed that like if you get a monkey to watch somebody else pick up a peanut, the same neurons will fire. And like in terms of dance, there's I recently watched a talk from Peter Gruber, who's actually a musician who works with neuroplasticity, and he was talking about like when a ballet dancer watches ballet, they have a lot more mirror neuron activity happening than if a ballet dancer watches capoeira. But then if a capoeirista watches capoeira, they'll have like a high level of mirror neuron activity. So it's basically like how I interpret this is that the more familiar you are with a movement language, the more you have kinesthetic empathy. And I think in codified dance, this can become a real issue because you watch something, and if you're not familiar with that very specific movement language, then it's just like, okay, like I can see there's a lot happening on stage, but I don't have this sense of like kinesthetic empathy. And like, and I think there's choreographers who've really done an amazing job of overcoming this. Like if you watch a Pina Bausch piece.
Or Deborah Hay.
When
we saw Deborah Hay last, what was it? February.
Like a year ago, yeah.
God, it was a year. When we saw her piece Animals on the Beach, and then her solo, My Choreographed Body, Revisited, I was so mesmerized, but I heard people like walking out of the audience and leaving because there was really no way for them to register and to completely pinpoint what it is that she was doing and why. Mm-hmm. You really couldn't. And this is a part of her practice. Yeah. But I loved it because there was another layer of depth added to the experience but I have to admit, I'm biased. I read her work. I am a super fan. I'm a fangirl. I love Deborah. So I think the reason that I was able to understand the depth and the weight of the work is because I have read about the practice, and I read about the process, and I also know from my own practices or my own experiences of trying to approach such a thing how challenging this can be. But other people in the audience who maybe aren't in the know of such a thing, it may just seem like nonsense on stage to them.
And she's also working with like wanting to challenge the habitual way of watching a piece,
and she's purposely doing that. She's
Yeah.
purposely doing that, and I find that interesting. I find that fascinating in myself. But maybe not everyone wants to see such a thing, you know.
Yeah, this is also the question here is. I mean, there's a more philosophical thing, but maybe if you're a fan of Deborah, and if you go to see Deborah, maybe it is about having read the books about the practice. Maybe it is about, maybe the full experience of watching it is about knowing this context.
The prior.
Yeah.
The a priori that's included.
I mean, there's like a lot of this in case of, I don't know, established Viennese choreographers. Like they don't need to do a good work anymore or a work of a certain quality. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't have, I say it has a lot. I'm just saying they don't have this requirement anymore because people perceive them through the prism of their whole career on how does this new work.
That's a good point, because now it makes me think, well, how do you capture the interest of a novice?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I've always been interested mostly about speaking to the people who have no relationship to the theater, but at the same time, if you make it too foreign, then again
Then you're commercial.
No. When you make the language too foreign, too difficult to understand, too weird,
then it's like highly conceptual,
too avant-garde. Then of course, some
It's
people
high art.
won't be open. Like, yeah, if I don't understand it, there's another thing. Like, people want to understand. Yeah, people want to know what's going on exactly, especially because I think theatrical experience is very narrative, or is supposedly narrative, or assumption is that it is a narrative experience. And because we are conditioned by the movies, by the plays, by, I don't know, musicals, whatever. So, and this is also part of this conditioning is always the language class, like we have the English language or the Polish language, always learning from a perspective of a text, so a perspective of words. So we often learn about, it's a matter of education as well, like we learn about culture from the perspective of words, so we do expect some kind of narrative when you go to see the dance performance for the first time, and that can be
I think it's because
difficult.
Unfortunately humans have created this notion that in order for us to really understand something, we need to be able to contextualize it within a verbal language, within a verbal understanding. And that's a whole nother conversation and a whole nother level of understanding that it's very difficult for people to kind of reach to or be interested in, because it is beyond linguistic and semantic and syntax. It's much further beyond that. And not a lot of people are there in their everyday, let alone being like put in that situation within an art context.
And this is something where though, like, I feel Mary Overley's work is a really great bridge for me at least, and like she speaks a lot about like also how do we as artists relate to our audience, because a lot of the time as artists we have a lot of assumptions about our audience of like, if I do this it'll be too complicated for them and they won't get it, or like they're gonna come with this expectation, I need to like break that expectation, I need to like deliberately not fulfill it or whatever. And then she's kind of saying, well, wait a second, like we're all very, very expert at reading space, at reading shape, at reading time, at reading emotion, at reading movement, at reading story. We do this all the time in our life. And then if you actually put that on stage, then people can read it if you assume that your audience might be able to. And so she speaks a lot about like maybe we as the artists need to stop and need to look at like who do we think our audience is.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think that's so key.
Yeah. And then she's talking about, one thing that I really like that she spoke about a lot is like how there's certain artists who you see their work and it can be something that you've never seen before, and yet you know exactly what you're seeing. You might not be able to explain it, but there's a sense of like you get it. And she actually used Pina Bausch as interesting as an example of this. But then what was really funny in this class I took with her, she spoke about how she got really addicted to this show. Like it was this show called like Find That Dress or something, and it's like where people are sort of finding this right wedding dress.
Yes.
And then it's kind of like they go to this mall and there's like some sort of person who's good at clothes who's sort of accompanying them, and they're sort of trying all these different wedding dresses. And then it's like, no, not quite, no, not quite.
Say yes to the dress?
Say yes to the dress, yeah, that's it. And then I never watched it, but they're sort of, she's really describing how they really like go through this thing of like...
It's great, isn't it?
And then there's always the moment when it's like they're sort of in the right ballpark, but not quite, and they're sort of getting closer and getting closer and getting closer, and there's this moment it's like, okay, this is the dress, and they're always like, and they're really like, get really blown away, and they're like, you can see their face shine, and she's like, that's what the viewpoints is about. It's like getting to that moment where like, even if it's like something you've never seen before, that there's this moment of like, okay, this shape, this position, this timing, where you're like, yes, I can, like things sort of click together into a certain kind of gestalt.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested in the practical application of crossover between neuroaesthetics and
I think Sebastian should talk to you about it. He's doing some cool research.
And choreography, I guess.
You can start. I can chime in.
oh God, what am I researching? What am I?
The practical applications, like what you're doing with dyslexia.
So basically, like, how do you go? Like, how do you make a step from being interested in research, scientific research, into okay, how can I take this now and put it into my dance?
Into a context. So I'm a teaching artist. Like, teaching is very integral to what I'm doing, and like my current research is sort of also gravitating around dyslexia and some of the differences in the dyslexic brain and the more typical brain. And I'm looking at some very relatively new research by a guy called Miguel Casanova, which I just think is a wonderful surname.
Yes.
And like
Suave.
so, yeah, exactly. Casanova.
Miguel,
Yeah. So Casanova was like researching lots of. He was dissecting lots of brains and is looking at like these structures called mini columns, which are like clusters of 80 to 100 neurons that are like on the surface of the brain and the cortex, and how widely spaced they are. So he found that people with autism have very, very tightly packed mini columns, and people with dyslexia have very, very wide mini columns. So, and then this has an impact on like, if you have very wide mini columns where there's lots of space between them, then they tend to make longer range associations, which means that you're connecting lots of different brain areas together in this very complex way, and where you're synthesizing a lot of distantly associated information. Whereas with autism, it's more like you're connecting up a lot of complex information within a brain area, but aren't so much linking that to other brain areas so easily. Mm-hmm. Everyone with dyslexia, everyone in the world, whether you're dyslexic or autistic or anything else, you're always making local and long-range connections, but there's a bias towards a higher proportion of one or a higher proportion of the other in dyslexia and autism.
So I think I would be more dyslexic than autistic in the end.
Well, the current...
Me too.
The current research is that, or the current consensus, whenever I've been doing reading, I always find estimates that range between 10 and 20% of the entire population being dyslexic, which means 1 in 5 adults, and that there's certain what they're calling dyslexic-rich occupations, where it can be as much as twice as many or more people who are dyslexic within that occupation. And the arts is known as a dyslexic-rich occupation, which means that if like all of the artists in the world were to get tested for dyslexia, doing like an adult dyslexia test, then there's a strong likelihood that there'd be like estimates are around sort of 40-50% of artists or more are actually dyslexic.
Probably more.
It explains everything.
Yeah.
My brain, it's making long associations. This is why it's just all.
Yeah, like I can never focus on one thing.
No,
never.
Yeah, same.
No.
It's difficult.
And then there's
it's so difficult.
And then the thing of not being able to focus on one thing, there's like also overlap with like ADD, where it's like, well, how are you supposed to focus if like I look at the thing, what are the object is, and I start to like link it to all sorts of different things, and then that can manifest as what they call ADD. Although autism, people with autism can also manifest like attention deficit symptoms, but they have a very different reason for it. And then if you're connecting like everything to movement as well, then you also can get very hyperactive. So there's like a lot of overlap between dyslexia and ADHD and ADD. So that's what I've been looking at, and and basically what I want to be doing is I want to be researching a pedagogy of performance making that's specifically designed to like bring out the dyslexic friendly friendly cognition that I think actually already exists within a lot of our practices. And I'm using the viewpoints as the basis, and I strongly believe that Mary was dyslexic. I know people who knew her quite well who know they're dyslexic and believe she's dyslexic. So I'm looking at sort of like looking at the viewpoints as a dyslexic friendly basis for teaching performance, and I want to be doing that maybe with teenagers. So that's one of my applications that I'm interested in at the minute.
I think this is extremely useful. Like this is something that I always wonder, like how art can contribute to the society, and I think this is brilliant.
Thanks.
Yeah, what are artists giving back? Are we living like this completely solipsistic life, or are we really like?
No, we also not getting a lot, but also
we don't earn. But I think we really work for ourselves a lot of the time. So it's nice to have these really direct applications.
And I think where this project came from partly was just like as a teenager, like going to my theatre classes were like my lifeline during school. You know, I just was like academically struggling with a lot of my subjects, and then going to theatre, like I just got motivated. I was like, I am getting into university because I want to study theatre, and then like I just everything in school got better for me when I did theatre, and I'm like, wait a second, that was partly because like temperamentally I think theatre's cool, but then like there's a level where it's like my theatre teachers were probably also themselves dyslexic, and they were creating this really dyslexic friendly environment where I could thrive, and where like this is why I left the wind band, right, this orchestra, because the sheet music not dyslexia friendly.
It's exact opposite, isn't it?
Yeah, I imagine.
I always find it with breakdance as well, like breakdance, because I'm like recently, since I don't know 7 years, learning breakdance, and there's a lot of this a certain kind of attention that you need to have, and I find it extremely difficult to concentrate on repeating one figure for ever, because it needs like 1,000 times or 2,000 times until you actually learn it, and you really need this attention span. It's really dyslexic unfriendly, I have to say. And I think
this is dyslexic unfriendly.
This is really interesting because I never, I never had like significant problems at school, so I was very good. But part of the reason why I was very good because I created all these strategies to deal with. Exactly. So like I would never do a homework, or I would always write it down. I would always have like my different ways to go around the topic. So like different strategies. I would be very active in order to know.
I was really hyperactive. Like I remember growing up as a child, my mom would come in my room and would just ask, why do you have so many things going at once? I would have the television, I would have the radio, I would have like some weird experiment, because I was always making strange science experiments and like boiling things, and like just like I was building things, I was taking trash, and like it was just like such strange. And then I'm reading, and then I'm writing, and then I'm like drawing something over here, and then like there was always so many things. And she's like, how do you focus when you have so many things going? And I'm like,
what does it mean to focus?
Yeah, I was like, this is focusing for me. And I think about it sometimes, and it makes me laugh, because it was like my room was always having like so many different things going. But that was for me how I was able to like zone.
Yeah, because you've got lots of information to connect.
Yes,
exactly.
Yeah,
one thing that you were saying about like breakdance and needing like long time to learn is one thing that I found very cool in the dyslexia research I've been doing. Was learning about procedural learning, and that with dyslexia there tends to be a weakness in procedural learning. So procedural learning is basically anything that's about automaticity, anything that's about like you learn a thing that's not like, it's not like innate that you know how to make coffee or something, like where you develop a automaticity of it. And with dyslexia, it's much harder to develop automaticity.
It's impossible.
Not impossible, but
it's challenging.
It needs like, so some researchers they worked out what they call the square root rule, which is basically like if most people take like 100 times to learn something, then the square root of 100 is 10. So you take 100 times 10, and then it ends up being 1,000 times. So basically, like you can take, so you can sometimes need like 10 times longer just to learn the same thing.
100 times longer. I'm telling you, 100 times.
Yeah.
Anything movement related, anything, because I think it's all procedural, as you said, unless you do the easy stuff. But if you do the hard stuff, it's just freaking difficult.
Yeah.
And then I have all these people that I teach, and they get it like this.
You're like, what are you?
But also like, okay,
What
I have the
are
benefit
you?
of having tried like all kinds of ways of learning
to
this
approach it.
this
yeah,
one.
I approach it from these angles.
Yeah, exactly.
So, like,
Exactly.
But
yeah.
like when it comes to my own benefit as learning is insane.
But there's like the advantage of the weakness in procedural learning is that dyslexic people tend to be better at inventing procedures,
Right.
which is what you're saying of like, okay, you can't just execute the procedure that you've been given, but then
So
like
you have to
find
deconstruct
you have
it,
to
and then
deconstruct it and
you
you
understand
recreate it. Exactly.
how to recreate it. Yeah.
And like,
yes.
and the other thing is that like we tend to, I'm dyslexic myself, by the way, like as dyslexics, we tend to then also use like, we tend, when we're doing tasks, we tend to use both our hemispheres more. So usually when people automate something, they tend to like compartmentalize into one hemisphere. So then they can sort of do it without needing to think about it. But whereas we have to like, we tend to use more of like bilateral processing, which actually in a way results from more mindfulness. So like if you're doing something which needs to be about creating a new procedure or doing something with a lot of mindfulness, then dyslexic people are very, very strong at that. But like, you know, I could never hold down like day jobs. Like, I don't know, I sort of tried day jobs working in like a cafe making coffee, and like doing the coffee machine was always just like, you know, because it's the same thing. It's the procedural learning. And it's like so stressful for me. And I'm looking at everyone else and they're just like, here's your coffee. And I'm like, wait, but now I have to press this button. Now I have to like...
Now it's a different press, right?
Exactly.
This is true. And like speaking of mindfulness, a lot of my work is actually coming into this world of mindfulness, and the application of it is really in this world of what's called mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a whole like word.
Sorry, I lost it. 4 words or 5?
Mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy.
5.
Yeah. And this is like a whole realm of therapy that's based on mindfulness practices. And a lot of the work that I'm doing and have done for my thesis was, what does it mean to kind of like deconstruct or suspend or sort of disorient your regimented experiences. And within my thesis, I was working on what does it mean to take away a language, actual verbalized forms of communication within the choreographic process, and how does this transform the choreographic process, especially when you're trying to communicate emotion experience, trying to communicate something that is almost unutterable or ineffable in a way. And what I'm finding and what research is showing and things that I was reading yesterday, a paper on what does it mean to apply mindfulness within the context of cognition or within the context of any form of neuroscience. And it's a new field that's coming into play and having all these different things like neurophenomenology and neuroaesthetics and different areas of psychology that are influencing the application of it. But what I'm really seeing is that there's a basis of transformation, both on what we perceive, but also in the actual biological level of neuroplasticity. That's like the main thing, is that you see people go through some form of a neuroplastic transformation. And so, yeah, in my work, like Sebastian, I'm just trying to create a platform in which people can engage with some direct neuroplastic transformation, like really do something that is having some form of a change in brain activation, because a lot of the times when we're measuring things with the near-infrared spectrometer, for example, we were looking at the TPJ, the temporal-parietal junction, to see this area is specifically and supposedly responsible for empathy. And so when it's activated, there's supposed to be some form of an empathic exchange happening. And so what if I can create some form of a choreographic technique or a choreographic approach that's allowing someone to have some upregulation or some up-activation in these different areas, which is enabling them to have some form of a reconstruction of their brain activity, which causes a reconstruction in their neuroplasticity of the cells, which causes some behavioral change.
Question to this.
Yeah.
Is great, but I'm wondering, like, how do you control the artist versus the how to say it properly? Because I have the feeling that this is all great and super, but the mission is very clear. But then if you implement it, there might be a certain like element of, but then in the end, like I have a taste myself and I have like, does the taste then override sometimes the mission? Like this is what's my like, or should the taste override the mission? Like at what point? Because I really think that if I have such a strong mission, then at what point is still art? Because it's, you know, the art, like the way for me to create art is connected with certain kind of pleasure, and if the mission is too strong, then it might be that the pleasure goes away a little bit, and then then the artist takes over, and now the mission is screwed. So I wonder how you keep this balance.
This is the balance I'm still finding, and this is where the mindfulness approach is coming in. This is where mindfulness is really, really setting a foundation, because, you know, I'm also having a hard time understanding, well, in mindfulness practices, you're supposed to really identify whether something is pleasurable or non-pleasurable or neutral. These three are your options. And, you know, most of the time we want to be continually increasing things that are pleasurable and decreasing things that are displeasurable. Whereas within this context of movement and this context of creating a choreographic technique, I think that there's a lot of room and space for both of them to occur. But I think with this mindfulness as a grounding, we have to realize that there's a possibility for pleasure to be transformed in how we're being experienced it and how we've before understood it to mean, what we've before understood it to mean. I think we have ideas and preferences of what we think is pleasure and what we think is preference, but there's a possibility for that to be transformed and for that to be changed within this mindfulness context, where you first have to actually step back and say, oh wait, maybe I should just set aside the way that I'm clinging or linking onto what does bring me pleasure or what doesn't, and just look at it as neutrally as possible. Yes. This is the focus. I'm a firm believer that it starts here, you know, it really starts here. And then we start to put it into a large systematic scale. And so when I was working with dancers for my thesis, and when I removed the element of language during the choreographic process, they were able to go somewhere that was very uncomfortable and very frustrating. Like, you know, after a session, after a day, they were really upset with me sometimes because they're like, I don't get it. I don't know what we're doing, and you don't talk to me. So I really don't know what's being experienced. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. I don't know how I'm supposed to feel. And I'm, you know, and there was only so much, there was really no information I could give them. You know, that was the experiment. But I was specifically placing them into a context where they were having to kind of rewind and step back and to start to really evaluate and question, well, okay, why am I having these type of interactions and these type of, boundaries being pushed and pushed into these places of discomfort? And so they were experiencing what we call the coping mechanism, in which when you go through an aesthetic experience and you encounter something that that one doesn't meet your preferences, but still feels really visceral and close to you, where you have kind of like this third stage where you're like, okay, how do I make a choice whether I go further in this and I continue to let it transform me, or do I push it away and say, no, that's too close to outside of my comfort zone. You know, like I don't want to deal with that. And so this third area is where I'm trying to push and pull and figure out in myself first, of course, and then, you know, offer it as something for other people to experience.
think this is circling very much back to Grotowski and,
Yeah.
and generally like the
Yeah.
theater maker experience, I think. I mean, I don't know, it is just from the books that I read. But
No, yeah, to me, it's a very common thing. We all want to present art that's giving people a presentation to experience something that they wouldn't normally experience in themselves, and to have some form of what we call update in preferences.
So isn't maybe then this the definition of aesthetical experience? Because this
Not always.
No. Right? So
Not always. No.
okay, then
Not
then
everyone is
maybe
doing
I have,
that.
Then maybe I have a question to Sebastian, because this is what I believe. But okay, maybe there's a difference between aesthetical experience and art. Like could also be. But I'm wondering, this is one statement here. The second statement is, our question or thesis in this case is that health is in opposition of art. And I'm just wondering, because for me a somatic method is like a self-improvement, mindfulness, self-improvement, self-awareness, becoming more in tune, becoming more normal in a way, becoming more yourself, becoming more of yourself,
Sort of more integrated,
Yeah,
and less awkward, less out of the ordinary, less strange. So I'm, like in my movement research, I've always been thinking that, and my assumption is that perhaps art is where the health kind of finishes, or the healthy approach finishes. I'm not saying that art doesn't have to be healthy, but there's some kind of opposition there that I'm like figuring out philosophically speaking.
I feel like art does give you a space in which you're allowed to do unhealthy things, and you're allowed to explore the boundaries of the estranged activities. I wouldn't say that art is inherently that, but I feel like it's a space and it's a platform of an opportunity from which you can really go to places that seem rather abnormal.
Right.
Yeah.
But abnormal doesn't have to be unhealthy, of course.
It doesn't have to be unhealthy.
But maybe then maybe I'm just referring to movement. Because in movement, if it's abnormal, then it's usually unhealthy, I think.
No, I don't know if I'd agree with that. I think that definitely there's a lot of what we consider normal movement which isn't very healthy, or like normal ways of moving our body, where we're stuck in chairs or stuck in front of a screen, and it's our body's able to adapt to a certain amount of doing those things, but like the extent to which we use our bodies for things which we haven't evolved to do, there's a lot of what's culturally normal which I don't think is biologically normal.
Right.
So it depends.
I'm always thinking of an example of, like, I don't know, gymnastics or breakdance or ballet. Like anything that, it just becomes like the highest forms of art in a way, the highest respected forms of art, and then just like it goes completely against the body. Like you can find health within, but in its origin, in its creation, it's going completely against the healthy way. It's just maybe a question. Like I'm just
there's been a lot of like also philosophical like debate around this. Like one thing that I really enjoyed finding quite recently, well, not that recently, a couple of years ago, was I read some of the writing of Eric Hawkins, who wrote a really beautiful essay called "The Body is a Clear Place," and he was like, Hawkins was really, I think of him as really creating like proto-release technique. He was creating a dance technique. He was married to Martha Graham for a while, and then he quit the Martha Graham company. And actually Martha Graham for a long time still was called officially on her passport Martha Hawkins, but she sort of like blacklisted him from a lot of the dance institutions. So his work didn't become that established. But he wrote this essay called "The Body is a Clear Place," where he talks about the most beautiful art is the most true art. And when it comes to movement, the most beautiful movement is the movement that's that's physiologically the healthiest. And he had like he tells a story with great pride in this essay of how after one of his performances, a man approaches him afterwards, and this man is a professor of kinesiology in a university. So he's really like, he's dedicating his life to muscle function. And then he's like, I watch your dance, and like you've really trained your dancers to really use their psoas muscles. And like when I watch ballet and I see it's all about the rectus spinae muscles, I always think, no, guys, physiologically you've got it wrong. And he was like, and this kinesiologist is talking about how beautiful he found his performance. And he was like, yeah, like I'm using the body in a physiologically correct way and I'm making it beautiful.
Yeah.
And like, so Eric Hawkins argues that way. I also respect that there's a lot of people that argue against that too. But yeah, I don't know.
I think it circles back to the idea of disgust and the beauty in the ugly. And I have the feeling that there is a lot. There's a lot of beauty in the places where the health finishes and where
Yes.
But yeah, it's an interesting. Like I know that there is beauty in perfectly organized human body. Yes, but then it's just a question, and maybe it's an art to organize the body in this perfect way. But is it art? And I'm just it's a question mark. I'm just wondering because I find myself like extremely like interested in somatics, but I had to break my connection with Feldenkrais. I couldn't do Feldenkrais because with Feldenkrais I was not able to learn those completely unpractical and completely unhealthy and weird breakdance figures, which is like, you know, like in breakdance you fall in a certain kind of contracted way. And if you do Feldenkrais, you always organize your body in a perfect way to the ground. So in the end, you can't learn. So it took me a huge, it was a huge journey to kind of train my body in order to tense itself while falling down. And it's a kind of interesting.
Yeah, although I would sort of question that a bit because like Feldenkrais' definition of learning is that when you've really learned something, you know that you can do a similar action in like a vast variety of ways, right? So it's kind of like, and Feldenkrais gives this nice introduction to one of his essays, I think, The Elusive Obvious, where he talks about like when he would be doing a functional integration, so a one-to-one session, he would always begin the sessions by asking like, well, like what would make you feel more human? And he sort of talks about like somebody who's like this girl who's got cerebral palsy who wants to become a ballet dancer. So he's like, okay, well, we're going to work towards you becoming a ballet dancer then. Like, and it's not about that we're going to get there or not, but if that's what your aim is, then that's what we work towards. And like, if you can progress from standing to the floor in like a very smooth, released, extremely physiological way, or if you can get from standing to the floor in a breakdance way, then you've really learned something because then you have the variety. And like, I think for me as a somatic practitioner, I'm most interested in like the process of perception and how the process of perception functions. And in my experience, I believe that perception, that like healthy perception is also about flexibility and like, you know, and then that's that thing of like, I have the flexibility about whether I see something as beautiful or see the same thing as ugly, you know? And I think that ability to sort of switch in and out of different perceptual modes, I think that's really at the heart of what somatic learning is all about, in how I understand it. And in that sense, like as artists, that's a huge like resource that we can draw on, is that we can go,
if we can use it for our audience.
Exactly. Because, and you know, a lot of like one thing that were we talking about this, or did we just send each other articles? Like I sort of like, I've been reading a lot of Gestalt psychology, and this whole thing of like how you can leave, whether you close a Gestalt or leave it open, and this, you know, this whole thing of like, if I sort of draw on a piece of paper 3 dots, then you see a triangle immediately. You sort of join the dots into a shape, right? And this thing, I think a lot of what we do in the arts is that we sort of, we play with this edge of like, do we close the gestalt or do we not close it? Because when we leave a gestalt open, when we leave something like incomplete, then there's like, then that can on one hand be frustrating because we generally tend towards that we complete gestalts. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, but then there's also this level of engagement. And it's like, I think that's a lot what we play with when we're making art.
Yes.
It's like if we close it too much, it becomes boring. If we leave it too open, it's just overwhelming.
So it's about like...
And there's like, where is that edge?
It's about like, do you control what your audience think, or do you leave them a place for interpretation? And are you a dictator? Are you not caring at all in a way of what they think?
I think that's just a part of the years of artistic practice. You kind of figure out and develop what that means for you and what you want and how that transforms within you based on, what your needs are and where you are. What was the question again? There was so many things.
I don't remember anymore.
Like so many
but I'm just maybe...
things,
I think I would like to ask you one of the last questions, and that is, do you have a name? What are you working under? Like, what are you working towards? And what is the thing that is cooking? Is there something cooking, or?
There's always something cooking. Always.
But there is an umbrella that we're
formulating.
Trying to open. So we decided to form a Verein, like a sort of not for profit cultural association, and we're both co-artistic directors. Mm-hmm. And I'm the educational director, and Imani is the research director. And we are in debate about a name. So the name that's currently on the table is Plexus, which refers, like the solar plexus is one example of a plexus. Like it means like a net-like structure of nerves, vessels, or fibers. And it comes from a Latin root, which actually an Indo-European root, which is plek, which means to weave. So it's got all these implications of like something that's held together in a net-like form.
But then you have more, or you're just two. Because if you're two, you just...
Well, we're looking at whether we're going to invite other people on board.
Yeah,
We've had discussions about who else we might like to invite, and
it's still forming. Everything is still in formation at the moment,
including the name.
Including the name, we haven't settled on the name yet. We're still like, finding a nice way to glue everything, all the ideas as much as possible. But we're still looking for artists and practitioners and folks that we want to help solidify a really solid base, because Sebastian and I really complement each other because of our interest, and we're giving to each other a lot. My research background, my science background, his somatic background, we're coming back and forth, his education background. We're doing this for each other, and so we're finding a really rich foundation already forming. So we're like, we might as well make this into something material.
I sometimes feel like it's quite funny when you look at us as collaborators, because like on paper I've studied like dance academically, and I feel like you have like all this like training which I don't have, and then like I sometimes feel like we've sort of crossed over each other's like things like on paper a lot of the time.
And then like Sebastian has so much knowledge and experience with somatic practices, and like you ask him a question, he has like 4 or 5 different books or articles to give you, about this area. And then my experience is more research-based. So if we were ever to get into a context of like doing an experimentation, I'd be like, no, like this and do this, we have to do this. So we're really like feeding each other, what would it require for us to kind of like, create a castle, a fortress that's exploring such a thing with lots of moats. Everyone's welcome.
Yeah. We've got like concretely, we've been doing like a weekly movement, public space movement jam.
Yeah.
Which has been great. We've just sort of like
It's been so good.
very. We've just invited people in our network to come and improvise in public spaces, and then we've been just setting up a camera and filming it, and it's been we've been doing a lot of like scores where we're using one word scores, like we did like flame or indigo or entrance. Well, no, it was exit, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And then it was like, how do we interpret this? And it's like, And so everyone's kind of working with the same word, but then like how their way into it is completely different.
And sometimes in different spaces. We've had some people who they do the practice, but they do it in their own public space because maybe they can't come.
Oh,
Because
really?
Iris did this as well. She was doing she couldn't come to a group session, so she did it, in her own context, and it's really great. It's such a fertile place to start from if we really want to be able to build into something and to really be able to work with people. We're keeping it very casual, very loose, and allowing us to just see where our artistic interests and our artistic proclivities start to really overlap. Yeah.
And part of how we've conceived the Verein is that we want it to be a platform both for like us individually to like just do projects independently from each other, but like under the same roof, and then sometimes we're sort of looking at conceptualizing some collaborations, which it's still coming together. There's like some labs that we're interested in running, like some I'd really like to run a composition lab, and thinking about sort of composition. What is an image, and how does an image move between people, and how do people recognize an image together, and
I'm wanting to do some disruptive labs.
some very disruptive
stuff. Just putting people in contexts where they disrupt their habitual emotion response to things.
So the brain plasticity again.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay then. Thank you so much for this talk. And,
thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, I mean, I love it. Like I feel like I've learned something, and that's amazing.
Yay!
And thank you for this. It's one of my most interesting conversations.
Cool.
And
thank you.
Good luck, because it's really cool and important. It seems like you have the knowledge and the spirit, and
I mean, we have the spirit. There's so much. What did I say the other day? What did I say in the text? There's so much to learn. I have so much to learn.
Yeah.
He sent me like 3 things to read. I'm just like, there's so many.
yeah.
There's so much to learn.
But I think there was the last person was I might be butchering it, but it was Newton, the last person, or was it who knew everything? I've already forgot, but it was like in 16th century, so a long time ago. Like there's no way to know at this point already.
Yeah.
But maybe with help of Elon Musk.
How did he make it into this conversation? The
We can
most
finally-
wealthy man in the world, right? Recently.
No, not most wealthy. Elon Musk. No, he's the one with the chip now.
He is the most wealthy recently. He surpassed
Yes?
Jeff. He surpassed Jeff
really?
Bezos recently.
Oh,
Wow.
good job, Elon.
Okay.
Yes.
He surpassed Warren Buffett as well?
I think they both surpassed Warren
Yeah,
Buffett
but a while ago. Yeah.
Well, great then. Anyway, there are those chips that maybe allow us to know more.
Yeah, I mean, this is a thing when we start talking about how do we get subcortical, but they aren't subcortical. They're all cortical, those chips. They can't go further, or you might end up paralyzed or a vegetable.
Right.
There's only so far you can go. They literally have you ever seen a paper or a video or documentary of how they implant this thing.
I've seen a video.
Yeah, it's such a delicate process for one. And they just kind of lay it, like they just place it inside, like not very much to take away. Well, I mean, there is a lot to take away, but not as much as you would think. The brain is such a complex organ.
Well, this is fantastic because that means that we still have time.
Oh, we have so much time. we have nothing to worry about.
Yeah.
Like, if we don't know, I feel like our brain is comparable to the sea, to the ocean. There's an infinite amount of things we don't know about the ocean, and it's the same thing with this system. Yeah, we're barely there.
Literally,
the deep
We're
ocean.
barely
Never
there.
been there,
Yeah.
almost.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, and how
Yeah,
long
it's
have we
like-
been around? So
It's like, how do these cells that are connected to each other, like, then, like, give us the taste of, like, chocolate? You know, like, it's like, there's such a huge gap between what we know about how a nerve cell transmits things, transmits a signal to, like, how then that gets encoded. I mean, it's just like...
And ethically, like, it's really impossible to look at such a process because we're not able to test on human subjects to the degree.
In these countries, yeah. I mean, it's a strange paradigm.
You're right.
Yeah.
I no thank you from me. From me,
Anyway,
it's a no thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
And,
thank you.
Thank you, Hygin. Thank you.
Hi, this is Hygin, and I hope you enjoyed what you just listened to. I love having those conversations, but it's a lot of work, so you can help me out by becoming a patron, whether it's on patreon.com or on PayPal. This will help to keep the quality and the frequency of the podcast. Otherwise, have a wonderful day and see you very soon.